Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're here to talk about the death of John F. Kennedy, which was the beginning of the end of the United States as we knew it, and who was responsible for this horrible, horrible tragedy. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a murder. Who was behind this murder? Why was Kennedy killed? Who wanted him dead? And what did George Herbert Walker Bush have to do with it? The problem is that Kennedy was, according to LBJ, an upstart. LBJ thought he should be the president, but LBJ didn't kill Jack Kennedy. Who wanted Kennedy dead? Well, David Ben-Gurion wanted him dead because Kennedy had Israel's nuclear weapons plant underground inspected at Dimona. However, the Israelis disguised the underground as a restaurant, and they put a fake wall in front of the elevator shaft that went down 5 floors below the first floor underground. And Kennedy's inspector was only allowed in for a day, and he never got to see the thermonuclear weapons plant on the 6th floor under one of the buildings at Dimona, which you can find on YouTube. A visual tour, virtual tour. Supposedly the Israelis used the Chicago mob to kill Kennedy. Now, FBI has recordings of a confession by Carlos Marcellos, who was in the Louisiana mob, which I happen to think may have false information from Marcello in it. However, I think it was done purposely. Marcello claimed that he had Oswald in his pocket, that he had Louisiana anti-Castro Cubans tell Oswald that Castro wanted Kennedy dead. There's 2 women who Mark Lane has as witnesses in his book Rush to Judgment that have Oswald taken his Marine manual to a CIA guy who was related to him, who Marcellus mentions was related to him, who was in some kind of training, some kind of training leader for some kind of military group in Louisiana, where Oswald says that Kennedy was too gutless to kill Castro. He wanted to kill Castro, and he wanted to kill Kennedy for not killing Castro. If Oswald, according to some, there's 2 sources that say Oswald was CIA. Mark Lane thinks he had a double in the CIA that killed Kennedy, and that he didn't kill Kennedy. In fact, there's a movie, Executive Action, that has Burt Lancaster and Will Geer and some other people in it who agreed with Dalton Trumbo that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy and that it was paid for by the CIA. Why did the CIA want Kennedy dead? Well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff came in to see John Kennedy in 1961 and tell him, as soon as he got into office practically, I was only about 9 years old when Kennedy ran in 60. I was 11 when he got shot in 63. So this was 3 months into Kennedy's only term. And I was in D.C. with my mother and father on a convention. I stayed at the Statler Hilton. I was there when the cherry blossoms were blooming. It was a beautiful spring. It didn't hit me until years later. I was there when John F. Kennedy was in the White House. when I was a little boy. I saw the Smithsonian Institute, the Spirit of St. Louis, the Constitution, the Washington Monument, and stood on the tidal basin with my mother. I looked over and saw 3 cherry blossom petals falling, holding my mother's hand. And also we went to the tomb of the unknown soldier. That was the spring of 1961. That spring, John Kennedy, and I remember wondering, why is Kennedy going to war so soon in his term? I mean, you know, we had World War II. We didn't need Korea. We didn't need Vietnam. We actually betrayed our allies. What happened was you had Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State. In 1947, Harry Truman signed a bill to create the CIA. He said he didn't want people with Nazi associations in the CIA, but Allen Dulles hired 4,000 Nazis to work in the CIA, and Hitler had a plan in 1943, when he was losing the war, to continue fighting those goddamn Bolshevik Jews, as he called them, the Russians. He wanted to create a famine to starve 40 million Soviets to death. And so he told the Nazis to surrender to us because they killed 29 million Russians, and tell us that they weren't really Nazis, they were just extremely anti-communist. That's exactly what Werner von Braun did when he surrendered. He was an SS officer, he knew Himmler, he knew Hitler, he made the V-2 rockets that maimed and killed Brits, and then he came over here with 300 German scientists and 187 train car loads full of V-2 rocket parts, and started the Army military rocket program in Huntsville, Alabama, which Eisenhower said we were going to have peaceful uses of space. When the Soviets put up the Sputnik in 1957, we didn't have a peaceful rocket that would go up, so we used von Braun's rockets, and that's what eventually we used his design for the Saturn V, and we went to the moon. Back in the good old days, when we had von Braun, he resigned in 1972 because Nixon had cut the budget to pay for the Vietnam War without raising taxes, because he didn't think we would pay for it. LBJ didn't raise taxes, he borrowed the money. And that's when inflation started at 3% a year. It's when they started selling gold to France, and that's when and then Nixon eventually went off the gold standard, which Ron Paul talks about. In fact, he ended the silver certificate, saying it was temporary. Although now you can still take dollars to the bank and get rolls of silver, well, you can get rolls of Kennedy $half if they're before 63. They're 90% silver. If they're after, between 63 and 68, they're only, I think, 40% silver or 30. But that way you can get silver for worthless paper, which otherwise is going to be worth zero pretty soon, because we're printing up so much money for this giant military budget. And why do we have this giant military budget? Because the Nazis and the CIA started the Cold War. We had General Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's master spy, against the Soviets, who had interrogated, or was in charge of interrogation of 4 million Soviets, POWs, 2 million of which were shot. 2 million were starved, tortured, and shot. And Gehlen traded his barrels of microfilm on the Soviet fortifications and military strength for a job in the CIA, where he later became head of NATO intelligence, and also practically started the Cold War single-handedly by telling us the Soviets were going to invade Poland in 1946 and Germany in 1947, and used Czechoslovakia for a springboard in 1948. to invade Europe and bomb the U.S. and UK. The Germans had planned on a manned orbiting bomber called the Silverbird. But the Silverbird, the Silverbird was going to be able to fly around the world in space and then come in and bomb. And they also planned some huge dirty bombs. So when the Soviets put up a Sputnik in '57, and I was just a little boy, I remember this thing beep, 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 a little ball up there. Didn't bother me, but it scared the goddamn Nazis to death, who were running our intelligence, and they had lied to us about the Soviets, saying they had 147 divisions, which they didn't have. The Soviet Union was devastated by the Nazis, and they had used dynamite demolition crews to demolish 9,000 miles of Soviet railroad track, and the Soviet Union is 9,000 miles from one end to the other, and the sun's rising. Russia, when the sun's rising on Russia on one end, it's setting on the other end, so that's a long damn ways. You have, it's 9,000 miles from the U.S. to Vietnam, which, by the way, Washington didn't want us to get involved in foreign entanglements. Especially George Washington didn't want, he advised against permanent military alliances, especially with European powers, and I'll be damned if NATO isn't a permanent military alliance with European powers. Not only that, you've got your World War I enemy, Germany, and World War II enemy, Germany, in NATO. And then you turned around and the people that helped you beat the Nazis, which was the Soviets, with a 3 million man army in '45 that invaded Berlin, where we lost 35,000 men invading Germany. Hitler wanted to make us, thought we would leave the war. He didn't even know we were industrialized. By the way, Hitler was a stupid little asshole who lied to his people, telling them he was going to have equality among the masses, that he was going to have this socialistic program. The rich industrialists who backed him said, "We will never support you if you do that." He says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to do that." He only had equality among the people of he had racial groups. The German racial group, supposedly the master race, which doesn't exist, he thought that that they were equal, but everyone else was going to be a slave, which basically meant he was going to colonize even the Japanese and the Italians after the war, whom he was just using to, during the war. But Ho Chi Minh helped us beat the Japanese because Churchill got Roosevelt to ally with Ho Chi Minh to fight the Japanese, who overran Vietnam for 2 years and raped, murdered, and plundered from '41 to '43 until we started taking back Japan. Churchill hadn't been ready for the invasion of Singapore, etc., etc. But we were allied with Ho Chi Minh during World War II. Then we turned around, de Gaulle wanted Vietnam back, Indochina back. Churchill didn't want to give it back to him, but he insisted, and so eventually we gave Indochina back to the Vietnamese, French. And then we helped the French fight Ho Chi Minh until, even while Eisenhower was in, until Kennedy wanted to pull out after the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Joint Chiefs of Staff went in and told him that this was Eisenhower's plan. It was Nixon's plan to kill Castro using the mob, and I thought the Chicago mob, and then invade Cuba with anti-Castro Cubans. However, the mob was run out of Cuba by Castro, and I'm sure they weren't going to go back and kill Castro. So that was a stupid plan, and Nixon had helped change the identities of Nazis who got jobs in the CIA, saying that they weren't really Nazis. And Carl Blessing is an example, who was a Nazi banker. I had to correct the Wikipedia account of Carl Blessing because it didn't mention that he had worked in the Reichsbank under one of Hitler's bankers during World War II. He was a Nazi. All of these Nazis, some of them were given citizenship, some were put in the U.S. Army, and you've got the Odessa files where John Voight's out there, who's, by the way, a right-winger, which is kind of crazy because the Nazis that got jobs in the CIA merged with the right wing of the Republican Party. So Nixon was using ethnic Nazi groups to campaign for John Dewey in '48, who was a friend of Hoover, who was a big anti-communist, who was calling Kennedy a communist for wanting to pull out of Vietnam, and called Martin Luther King a communist, who was not a communist. Who reads Stephen Oates' biography, Let the Trumpet Sound, the biography of Martin Luther King, and Stephen Oates also wrote the biography of Abraham Lincoln, which I recommend by him, and John Brown's biography, and Nat Turner's biography, and a bunch of other historical accounts of the South. Oates was an historian at Amherst College in Massachusetts. I don't know where he is now. I've seen him on public TV. Mark Lane was Kennedy's campaign manager in 1960. He's got pictures of him and Eleanor Roosevelt, him with Jack Kennedy. Hoover, I hear, framed Oswald. There's a book called The Act of Treason. Hoover wrote a book called Masters of Deceit, where he describes the activities of a communist and deceiving people by how he travels by bus and taxi and walking and all kinds of diverting activities. The same account, almost word for word, is in there in the Warren Commission report that Lane has in Rush to Judgment about Oswald's activities, supposedly, after he shot Jack Kennedy. Well, suppose that Oswald did have a double in the CIA because, well, here's the strange story. The San Francisco Chronicle says Oswald was CIA, that all of his friends were CIA, that he was a red baiter in the South. They gave out pro-Castro pamphlets, and then they would arrest the people that sympathized with Castro. And there's a thing in the JFK movie which was based on a bowdlerized version of Rush to Judgment by Oliver Stone, who told Lane he wouldn't use his book, and then used everything except he changed the name or changed one thing and made the whole thing false. So it kind of turns out to be ridiculous, so that you can kind of refute the JFK movie. But there is some grain of truth in there near the end when Kevin Costner is there in the trial, and he's talking about what happened. There's just maybe one sentence in there that has something that's true, but the rest of it, a lot of it's baloney or a mismatch of the truth. Kind of a hodgepodge of the truth, kind of like you took the truth and cut it up into pieces and took out parts and then put in a stew pot. You know, that's kind of what that movie is. It just doesn't seem to be in logical order. If you go through Lane's book, Rush to Judgment and Plausible Denial, was the CIA involved in the JFK assassination, then you get the truth. But you have the Nazis causing all kinds of trouble. They got us into Korea, saying Truman was soft on communism, saying he lost Red China in '49. He says, I'll show you how soft on communism I am. I'll invade Korea. So we invaded Korea. MacArthur goes over there. He takes over the whole peninsula. Then he invades China against Truman's advice. And Truman fires him, and the Chinese come in and take back half of Korea, which if MacArthur hadn't invaded China, we wouldn't have a North Korea now. everything would be hunky-dory over there, but no, MacArthur had to disobey orders because his mother, they told him that's how you advance in the army, because his grandfather had advanced in the Civil War by doing that, etc. Read the story. So it turns out that so we went from World War II, where we were successful. We didn't really beat the Nazis. We beat the Japanese, and then the Russians beat the Nazis, and we took back France with Eisenhower and D-Day. Eisenhower said we didn't need a big peacetime military budget, which we didn't, and we didn't need another conventional war. He didn't want a conventional war with Russia or China. You might as well say any conventional wars in Eurasia. And that pretty much goes along with Washington's the idea of not getting involved in foreign entanglements. In fact, if Hitler hadn't invaded or tried to conquer England, if he hadn't sunk our ships, and he was sinking 2 million tons of merchant marine ships off the coast of New Jersey, off the east coast here, for the first 2 years of war, until Churchill decided to run him out of the Atlantic because they were cutting off supplies to England. Basically, that's why he was sinking subs ever since the Lend-Lease. And Churchill spent all night with Roosevelt and getting Roosevelt to enter the war. So, it took quite a while for Woodrow Wilson to enter World War I. But we beat the Germans in World War I. We beat them in World War II. Then we lost the peace. Basically, and this goes back to something Dr. Allenson, my old mentor, used to say. Why did we go to war with Germany? The capitalists in the United States and Germany wanted to take over the world markets, and the Germans got greedy and wanted it all, so we split. GM had made tanks for the Germans, they'd made engines for the Ju-88 fighter bomber, Krupp Steel, which was the German steel empire that financed Kaiser Wilhelm in World War I and Hitler in World War II, had built the steel mill. I don't know if it was in Manchuria, which Japan had invaded, or where the steel mills were over there. But I heard later that Stalin gave them the Mao Zedong, so they must have been in China. In Manchuria, that later became Mitsubishi Steel. Now, whether I probably got the geography wrong, but wherever the hell Mitsubishi Steel is, that's where the Krupp Steel plant was that made the steel. When my father fought Japanese in World War II, I remember he brought back a Japanese rifle his brother gave him. His brother was a paratrooper in the occupation of Japan. They're both dead now. The gun, I remember looking at this gun, of all the junk the Japanese used to send over here before they started sending cameras and motorcycles and cars back in the 50s, this rifle, this steel was blue-black steel, and I remember, where in the hell did they get this steel? Well, it turns out that, I guess that was German steel. Okay, makes sense. So you had this steel company, Krupp Steel, which later was bought out by Thyssen. Mr. Thyssen had lost his fortune in World War I, so he swore he wouldn't do that again. This has something to do with the Kennedy assassination, so bear with me. Fritz Thyssen was his son, but the old man had, I forget his first name, had started 3 banks, his own banking system, one in Berlin, one in Rotterdam, one in New York City. Allen Dulles and his crooked brother John Foster helped launder Hitler's billions with the Bush family. George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush. I forget the first name. I keep thinking John Prescott. It's not John Prescott. It's George Herbert Walker Bush is named after George Herbert Walker and Prescott, and the other Bush. But anyway, those were his grandfathers, and they were involved in the New York bank that had Fritz Thyssen's billions stolen by Hitler. Okay, and this money went from Berlin to Rotterdam to New York and back and forth in a shell game while the Allies were searching 4 years for a foreign bank where Hitler's money was, and it wasn't in a foreign bank. So for 4 years they were asking Mr. Thyssen, which foreign bank did you put it in? And he was saying, I didn't put it in, and they couldn't find it in a foreign bank. It wasn't in a foreign bank, it was in his banks. And a couple of men were killed when they got on the scent of this, one in Europe and one in New York. So you can read the story if you look it up. And look up the Allen brothers as the Foster, George, what is it? Now I forget the name. No. John Foster Dulles. Look up the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, especially as traders on the internet, on Wikipedia. So you have, and Allen Dulles was a big friend of George Herbert Walker, and Kennedy fired Allen Dulles in '61 after the Bay of Pigs. Okay, he also fired George Bissell, and he fired General Campbell. Well, by the way, the Nazis had been smuggled out of Europe by way of the Vatican, rat lines. Hitler had made a deal with Pope Pius XII in 1933 because the Pope was afraid the communists were going to destroy the Catholic Church. He heard Hitler was going to fight communists. Hitler couldn't take power with the German Catholic Center Party, so he made this deal with the Pope. I'll let you say, your priests say Mass, support the Catholic schools, but you have to get out. You have to get the Catholics out of politics. When they did that, he became the Führer. After he was Chancellor, he got elected President of Germany after 5 elections. And then, of course, he had everybody shot that opposed him, and then had the firing squad shot that shot the first group of people, and then had those firing squad shot, so nobody even knew who shot who. So eventually, we had World War II, then we had Korea, and then we had Vietnam, which we never should have had, and which Nixon said he was going to pull out of, and then turn around and escalated the war. John Kerry says he went to Vietnam in '68, and when there was 4,000 dead. At the end of the year, there was 13,000 dead. That was the year Nixon was elected. Between '69 then and '73, when Congress cut off funds during the Ford administration, who was never elected, but appointed by Nixon, who then ran the White House from San Clemente by phone calls, you had the rest of the 58,000 dead. So you take 13,000 from 58,000, you get 45,000. So I'm putting that 45,000 on Nixon's watch, and America can take note. And Richard Nixon was not just a crook. His middle name was not Milhouse, it was really Milhausen. He surrounded himself by Germans. He was an anti-Semitic. He talked about those Christ-killing Jews, and I got that from a Jewish woman here in the state that I'm in. Which I'm not divulging at the moment, but you can guess from what I said earlier. The problem is that Nixon even wouldn't let any Jews make foreign policy, but by the way, American foreign policy is based on public opinion, and public opinion is private laziness. So American public policy is based on private laziness. There should be an honest foreign policy. George Washington said we should not favor or disfavor any nations. You don't know who your real friends and your real enemies are. You may be favoring nations that are allied with your enemies. You may be disfavoring nations allied with your friends. You may be hurting your friends and helping your enemies. And that's basically by helping Germany and allying with Germany after World War II, that's exactly we allied with our enemy. So here these guys were lying to us the whole time, and when the Army intelligence said that General Galen was false about the Soviet 747 divisions, battle ready to take over Europe, Galen accused the Army intelligence of being communist. Then Nixon used captured Nazi documents to accuse the members of the Truman administration being communists, him and Joe McCarthy, and that's where the McCarthy era came from, which I always wondered about when I was little. So you had this, and Ronald Reagan, even Nancy Reagan was accused of being a communist, and you know damn well Nancy Reagan was not a communist. So a lot of Jewish writers were called communists. Well, in fact, Jack Warner, who was Jewish, Ronskalazer, one of the Ronskalazer brothers from Poland, said if you were fighting Nazis in the 33, a lot of people joined the Communist Party because the communists were fighting the Nazis. The fact that Hitler wanted to keep fighting the communists in Russia, kind of, you know, and the Bolshevik Jews, as he called them, and you have even Zuckheimer says that that was the Russian Revolution was a Jewish revolution. By the way, the Jews could get jobs in Russia, in the Soviet Union. They could not work in Europe. They were banned from most jobs in Europe, but they could have most jobs in the Soviet Union. And Marx was Jewish, although he became more and more anti-Semite as he got older, but I guess you'd call a self-loathing Jew. But the fact is that I had German nuns who escaped from Nazi from Nazi Germany back in World War II. Hitler killed some Polish Catholic priests and in concentration camps, and some Polish nuns. I think 95 priests. Anyone who did not swear allegiance to Adolf Hitler, body and soul, was suspect and could be killed pretty much at will, or at whim. And the fact that U.S. Congress cut off Polish Jewish immigration in 1921 and 24, basically severely restricted it when there's 3 million Polish Jews that wanted to come over here. Those Jews were later killed by the Nazis in World War II. So you have to think, there were only 300,000 Jews left in Poland. 100,000 came here, 100,000 went to Israel, 100,000 scattered to the four corners of the earth. There has to be resentment against the United States, who I hear by 1939 the head of U.S. immigration was anti-Semitic. I'm even hearing that Roosevelt was anti-Semitic, and I'm hearing that it was very hard for Israel to become a state in 1948. Also, from the Dreyfus affair and this movie on Emile Zola I just saw a couple of weeks ago, I found out that France was divided as anti-Semite and not anti-Semite, and that's why Vichy France was pro-Nazi. And that kind of is a strange but true thing that happened, because you have movies like Casablanca, where you have the loyal French underground, led supposedly by de Gaulle, who I think had to kill a man to get the job as head of the underground. I don't think de Gaulle should have been the head of the underground, but that's the way it ended up, because he was a colonist, and basically wanting Vietnam back as a colony is what led us into the war in Vietnam. So France, which helped us beat the British in the American Revolution with Lafayette and Lafitte, ended up betraying us on this issue on Vietnam. We should never have helped. We should never have fought in Vietnam. That was a complete failure of foreign policy. And I remember the Greek civilization fell because they overextended their empire. The Romans fell because they overextended. The British lost the American Revolution because they were 3,000 miles from home fighting on unfamiliar territory. Here we were 9,000 miles fighting people in their own country, killing tribal leaders, and the CIA killed 28,000 tribal elders in Vietnam, assassinated these people, and you know, we had the American Indian chiefs, the wise old chiefs, and here you have these wise old people in Vietnam, and then here we're over there killing them. And then I just heard some horrible things the other day about the CIA in Mark Lane's new book on The Last Word, what the CIA was doing in Vietnam, cutting tops of people's skulls off and putting implants in and giving them knives and trying to make them kill each other with electrodes and all this crap, and then killing the people when it didn't work. We killed 1 million civilians in Vietnam and 2 million Vietnamese Army regulars. So that's 3 million people. That's pretty much. And then we dropped Agent Orange all over the place, which is still causing horrible things. And we left landmines all over the place. And so Vietnam is a horrible, horrible episode. It took us 10 years to get out of it. It means our political system works, but the people have gone to sleep. They've forgotten that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty in the West, and they've forgotten that God creates out of nothing. So we need to get involved, and we need to take back our country. Ron Paul is a pretty good politician, but he doesn't know much about economics. He's got some kind of Austrian economic theory. I got to tell Ron Paul, free market capitalism, you might as well call it robber baron capitalism, turns into monopoly capitalism, and monopolies are the problem now. You've got about 40 international corporations running the world. They don't care about the people in the United States or Russia or China. They just put their factories in the most suitable geographic region where they can make the most profit. And they're chasing cheap labor around the world right now. They don't care about pollution. I mean, we had a pollution crisis in '69, and Jacques Cousteau warned that the oceans are dying. A few more oil spills, you won't have any fish in the sea. You won't have any life on Earth. We've got to double hull the ships. We've got to do all this stuff. But from the time of World War II, from the time that Galen got into CIA, the United States has gone downhill through the 50s, the 60s. Well, we had a prosperous time in the 60s. The people didn't know what was going on, but you started to. Stalin died in '53, and the UFO program started in '53. I mean, the spying on Russia by weather balloons and on these U-2 planes, all this started in '53. So when Eisenhower was saying we didn't have any of these planes, we did have them, but he didn't know we had them. So he was embarrassed when Gary Powers got shot down. The CIA, which I call the Nazi-infested CIA, and then what's George Herbert Walker Bush got to do with this? Well, according to Lane, GHW Bush was in charge of the Bay of Pigs invasion in '61. The ship used was called Barbara. He was in Zapata Oil, which was a perfect cover for him, and could travel. Which, by the way, was an oil company that never made any money. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. Zapata Oil, there was a ship named Zapata at the Bay of Pigs. This invasion was doomed to failure by George Bissell from the beginning. It was not an Eisenhower plan. Eisenhower would never have done it without air cover. Kennedy could not legally use U.S. Air Force to invade a sovereign state. And I got news for you right-wingers out there. You cannot invade a sovereign country legally by international law unless they attack you first. And Cuba never attacked us. Okay, Iraq never attacked us. Okay. And as far as I know, Afghanistan never attacked us. Bin Laden attacked us, but basically he attacked us because the Israelis stole a bunch of land in '67 in a war they started by blowing up stuff. And the Israeli Mossad went around Israel blowing up stuff in Arab countries, making it look like Israel did it. When the Arabs got ready to invade Israel, the Israelis preemptively struck Egypt, took the Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip. They were getting ready to do the same thing with the West Bank and Jordan and the Golan Heights in Syria, when we had a spy ship over there listening and heard them lying to Jordan, telling Jordan that the Egyptians had conquered Israel. When Jordan sent troops into Israel, then they took the West Bank. When we told Israel we heard them lying to Jordan, they bombed the USS Liberty spy ship, which was electronically surveilling them, which is what NSA does, and they killed 34 American sailors and who were sunbathing on the deck in an unarmed ship 12 miles off the coast and flying a giant American flag, and said they didn't know it was us. That was an accident. It was not an accident. They torpedoed the ship. They bombed the ship. It had 7 holes in it. It's a wonder it didn't sink, and 170 some men were wounded. You can get a DVD on it, and on the USS Liberty, Dead in the Water. Look at their website, look at the book on this thing. The whole thing was covered up. Johnson was in Vietnam in '67. He was afraid the Russians or the Chinese would come in. The Russians were allied with Egypt. He told the Israelis, if you invade Egypt, I can't help you. If they invade you, I'll help you. He had, I think, the 6th Fleet or the 4th Fleet, one of the fleets off. They had the 6th Fleet 400 miles off the coast, ready to come in, but he never helped the Liberty, and eventually the Israelis said it was not delivered. It was delivered. Ostrowski says it was delivered in his books, which is by way of deception and the other side of deception. By the way, Ostrowski knows the story about the Mossad, but Richard Clark only knows he doesn't trust the Mossad. He doesn't know that the Mossad lied to us to get us in Iraq. He doesn't know a lot of stuff about the Mossad. He has a book, Against All Enemies, where he knows that Iraq did not attack us on 9/11 or in the first Gulf War. When the Trade Center was blown up the first time in the basement, that Bin Laden did it. It had nothing to do with Saddam, and we were allied with Saddam, etc., etc. But anyway, back to Kennedy. What was George Herbert Walker Bush doing in Dallas the night before Kennedy was shot and the morning he was shot? You see these flyers put up saying Kennedy was a communist. He was a traitor because he had said he was going to pull out of Vietnam by '65. He'd actually signed an executive order to pull out a unit, one of the 16 units, and pull the CIA out and dismantle the CIA. That was enough for the order to go out from the CIA to kill Jack Kennedy. I have a video on this, Master and Master, on here about that, but you need to know that the CIA was one of the groups, the Mossad was one of the groups, the Chicago mob and Louisiana mob were involved, and since the mob is the mob, you figure Chicago mob and Louisiana mob are tied together. Marcellos was mad at Bobby Kennedy because Bobby had deported him back to Guatemala, where he said he was from. He was really from Sicily, but he thought if you killed John Kennedy, you get rid of Bobby Kennedy, and a lot of people were mad at Bobby. Jimmy Hoffa was mad at Bobby, which, by the way, Hoffa had stolen about $9 million while head of the Teamsters, and read Bobby Kennedy's book, The Enemy Within. And Bobby was really anti-communist and wanted to nuke Cuba, and John McCain says he was on the runway in a bomber armed with nuclear weapons ready to bomb Cuba then, and he's ready to go to war now when he's talking about Iran. Iran, by the way, is not making nuclear weapons, and John Kennedy didn't want Israel to have nuclear weapons. Israel has enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire Middle East. So that was one of the groups, the mob was one of the groups, the CIA was one of the groups. These groups all wanted Kennedy dead. And the fact that 22 witnesses were killed after Kennedy was shot, eyewitnesses who saw someone shooting from the grassy knoll or heard someone shooting from the grassy knoll, etc., etc. You can find them here and there on YouTube, and they're all dead. And so you have, and then witnesses who none of the witnesses who said they saw Oswald kill Tippit saw Oswald kill Tippit. The only woman who saw who killed Tippit, Officer Tippit in Dallas, the day Kennedy was shot, saw a short, fat, bald man running to the bus. That was the guy that killed Tippit. Her testimony was never used. The gun that killed Kennedy was not an Italian gun. It was a German Mauser, and was a different caliber. The 5 cops who said it was an Italian man-liquor carbine earlier, the day before, it said it was a German Mauser .765 caliber, not the lower caliber that they said later. The bullet that was planted, by the way, the first bullet hit John Kennedy in the neck. The second bullet, what's his name? John Connally was there. The first shot he heard hit Kennedy because he turned around. Kennedy was holding his neck. The second shot hit Connally and went through his back and came out his front of his chest, went into his right leg, through his wrist into his leg, and pieces of that bullet were still in his leg. That bullet supposedly turned up untouched on a stretcher, or what do you call it, a gurney outside of the room where Kennedy was in the hospital. That was not the same caliber bullet that went through Connally. Okay. And that bullet didn't have a scratch on it. The bullet that went through Connally was shattered. So you could not have had that bullet be the same bullet. The Warren Commission never investigated the murder. They only tried to prove what they already thought was true. And who was on the Warren Commission? One of the people Johnson put on was Allen Dulles. Here's the guy Kennedy had fired, the crooked lawyer who had helped launder Hitler's billions with the Bush family, which is where they got their money, by the way, and they had to give back some land they got for trading with the Enemy Act. There should be, before George Herbert Walker Bush dies, I want someone to know that he's wanted in Cuba for the bombing of the Cuban Airliner coming back from the Olympics in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected president. Carter fired George Herbert Walker Bush as chief of CIA. Bush had helped the people that blew up the plane escaped from a jail in Venezuela, where they walked out of jail where the guards had their backs turned to the wall, and the guys got in a speeding car and took off, and later Bush pardoned these guys. One of them, I think, is still alive if you check out this story. A bomb was put on a plane that was in a camera that these 2 guys had left on the plane when they got off from Barbados. When the plane took off from Barbados, the plane blew up. It had the 34 members of the Cuban Olympic team, the teenage fencing team on there. It had 5 Koreans on it and about 78 or 79 people on Cuban Airliner 454. This was masterminded by George Herbert Walker Bush. There's no statute of limitations on murder in Cuba, and I don't think anywhere, in fact. And so Bush is still wanted for this. And the guy goes around, he was in Dallas the night before Kennedy, and the morning Kennedy was shot, probably in charge of putting up these flyers calling Kennedy a communist and a traitor. Along with, E. Howard Hunt and who else was there, and Oswald's double, and all these guys were there ready to kill Kennedy. And you watch the movie Executive Action, how the crews were trained. There was three ex-Marine guards were hired to shoot Kennedy in Dallas. They were supposed to pose as guards. You had a guy behind the grassy knoll fence with a suit and a rifle saying he was FBI. That's where shots came from that killed Kennedy. The witnesses, there was a guy with a camera that this same FBI guy tackled later and took his film and tore up the camera. That same guy with the rifle handed the rifle off to a guy dressed in railroad bib overalls, the striped overalls, who went down the railroad track behind the grassy knoll and opened up a box on a telephone pole and put the rifle in the box, and I guess locked it. So you have that eyewitness testimony of that by I guess he was a deaf man who the FBI never used the testimony. And then why was the FBI file sealed on this for 25 years? Because Hoover was involved in framing Oswald and covering up this thing. So you've got, and then they blamed it on the communists, and the whole thing was, you watch the movie with DiCaprio, and Hoover's calling Kennedy a communist in a couple of places, and Hoover really believed this crap. And meanwhile, you had the mob had stuff on Hoover for being a cross-dresser, etc., and Hoover would never admit the mob existed for quite a while. But the fact that the mob, according to you have Sharif and dead Gaddafi now, who by the way was framed on the Lockerbie thing by the Israelis. Libya never had anything to do with Lockerbie. That's bullshit. And Reagan bombed Libya and killed 46 people back in '86, and then we bombed it to smithereens, all for nothing, because they were going to go on the gold standard, and Gaddafi was printing up gold coins, and he was helping 5 African countries that needed help that Israel doesn't need, but we're giving Israel $3 billion in cash every January because they've got their top spies here. Since we hired Nazis in the CIA and they were looking for Nazis, they came over here, eventually took over, and now they're running pretty much the country, running Congress, blackmailing Congress, bribing Congress, routinely coercing Congress, like Hagel says, intimidating Congress to support Israel, which doesn't need the money, but we need the money, and we don't have any money now because we're broke fighting undeclared wars. We haven't declared a war since 1941. Vietnam was never declared, and we lost 58,000 men over there. Korea was never declared. We lost 38,000, I think, 35 to 38,000. We've lost a lot of men in Iraq, 5,000 and 100,000 wounded probably, or 60,000 or more. Maimed, brain damaged, armless, limbless, legless, handless, whatever. All these horrible things that we've done to our youth over there, who trusted us, and then we were betrayed. We betrayed our allies, and now we're broke. And pretty much look at Paul Craig Roberts and Ron Paul saying what's going to happen. We're going to end up like Detroit, bankrupt. Pretty soon the dollar will go to zero, the economy will collapse, and I think it's pretty much like Nazi Germany after the war, except we haven't been bombed back into the Stone Ages. However, everything else but we have been pretty much destroyed, and they destroyed the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment they shredded. And they're talking about taking away the power of the president to kill people without a trial. It's against the Geneva Conventions of War to kill people, without a trial. If you don't have a fair trial, and even Ron Paul thought that Bin Laden should have had a trial. We tried the Nazis at Nuremberg, but thousands of Nazis got away that were wanted in Poland and Russia. SS and Gestapo that should have been tried, that should have been hung for an involvement in the Holocaust. These people got jobs over here and ran your CIA. So you cannot trust the CIA, and they let you down on 9/11 because they didn't tell you when Bin Laden's people were in the country, which they knew 2 months before 9/11 that 2 guys were in California, and 1 guy came through with a fake French-Canadian passport, or French-Algerian passport from Canada. They knew the guy was here, and they didn't tell the FBI until 9 days before. And by the time the FBI was looking for these guys, they were flying into the Trade Center. These guys were Saudis because Bin Laden used Saudis. Read Noam Chomsky's book 9/11. Why? And I have the 3 reasons why. on my videos here. One of them was that King Faisal of Saudi Arabia had not let bin Laden use his Mujahideen take back Kuwait from Iraq. Instead, he let George Herbert Walker Bush took 25,000 mostly Christian troops in Saudi Arabia. That war, by the way, was started by the Israeli Mossad, who agitated between Kuwait and Iraq to get the Gulf War started. They assassinated a Kuwaiti political cartoonist, made it look like Iraq did it, and on and on and on. So the entire Mideast crisis is a result, and Netanyahu is part of the Mossad. They do not want peace, they want war or unconditional surrender. And like I said, Kennedy was assassinated. One of the reasons was because the Mossad and Ben-Gurion did not want, and Ben-Gurion resigned after he let Kennedy inspect the Timona nuclear weapons plant. He wanted Kennedy dead. So if it's true that he used the Chicago mob, and you have Carlos Marcellos saying he had Oswald in his pocket, he probably had Oswald's double in his pocket. That's not even true. You know, it could have been Oswald and his double killed Kennedy. The fact is Kennedy's dead. And the fact is that Johnson reversed his policy in Vietnam. Kennedy was pulling out, and Johnson reversed that. So that's, and then Nixon escalated it into Laos and Cambodia. It was an undeclared war. And those guys, it was an illegal war, it's an unconstitutional war, and it was a war we borrowed money, and it was a war where we spent the money for NASA for the moon shots. So Nixon put the Saturn V in a museum in '73, and we haven't been to the moon since '73, and now we don't have a moon rocket. I think you should take the Saturn V's out of mothballs, clean them out, and refurbish them, and get the mouse nests out of them and reuse them, because von Braun wanted to build a moon base, and he wanted to use the Saturn V to make the space shuttle, not this piece of crap that we used that killed 14 people. The Saturn V never killed anybody. At least it had safety built into it, and the space shuttle didn't. You had, it's liquid fuel, you can turn it on and off. The space shuttle had solid fuel and liquid fuel. You cannot turn solid fuel off, you can't steer it. And the dynamite bolts are dangerous that blow off the solid fuel boosters, and we think that part of one of those bolts that weighed 70 pounds, a 35-pound piece, put a hole in the wing of the Columbia that melted off at 2,000 degrees when the aluminum alloy is only designed to go to 900 Fahrenheit. So you had, that whole thing was a horrible design. Bin Laden, Werner von Braun had a space station planned in '55, a space shuttle using the Saturn V booster, which was the most powerful liquid fuel booster in the world, to build a moon base from which we would go to Mars. You can't go to Mars from Earth. The gravity's 6 times stronger. It would take too much fuel, etc. With a moon base, it's 1/6 of the gravity. You could easily go to Mars and back. And with the shuttle providing service to the moon base, going back and forth, and first using it to build the space station, then using that to supply the moon base. That's how NASA should have solved the problem. Kennedy wanted to go to the moon. We went to the moon. And then von Braun resigned in '72, saying that NASA was not committed to a safe manned space program. That's because Nixon had cut the budget and LBJ had cut the budget. So quick as we got to the moon, the budget was cut. A lot of engineers committed suicide every time they had a moon launch. They were put out of work, and so they committed suicide. So we killed our own space program, and now America really doesn't have an effective space program, and this is basically due to the death of John F. Kennedy, because we would have pulled out of Vietnam. The '60s would have been a wonderful decade. Would have been pretty much like George Washington wanted, where America would have become stronger. And by the way, they don't know anything about mental illness and how to treat it in this country. These pills they're giving people make them worse. It's medical fraud. They don't really know how to treat women, especially, and they don't know how to treat heart disease or cancer. So they're really, their diet and everything they've got going here is just horrible. So it's pretty much hell, which is why I'm wearing this mask, because this is America is hell. This is from America, the American hell that we created since World War II. Our generation, the baby boom, Clinton talks about the baby boom. He doesn't represent me. I'm part of the baby boom. I'm younger than him. I was born in 52. He was born in, a few years earlier. I think he's born in 42. He's 10 years older than me. He's really not part of the baby boom. If he's born in 42, which I'm sure he was in World War. So, the baby boom is after the war, Bill, not before the war. He's really World War II generation. That generation gave us Hitler and all the other dictators that we've been talking about. They were not the best generation. We are the best generation. We were sold down the river by the World War II generation, who pretty much right now are dying, but they're, the old farts are running the country, and the Israelis are running them. So you have the Mossad, the Israeli lobby, and the fact that we hired these Nazis, we betrayed our Russian allies, and Russia was never really our enemy. In fact, Napoleon got us to ally against Russia when he was fighting Russia, but Napoleon was a mass murderer. So think about it, folks. You're allied with the wrong countries. You should be friends with everybody, but not treating anybody. You should not. China shouldn't have favored nation status. We shouldn't be supporting Israel. We need to support ourselves. We need to rebuild America, bring the boys home, guard our borders, and I would put, a man with a pup tent and an M16 every 10 feet on the Mexican border if I had to. But the Israelis are running drugs up from Colombia through the southwest U.S., and you don't think the Mexicans are running this by themselves, do you? It's running from Tel Aviv, and then they can launder the money through their banks, and so you don't know. A lot of what's going on in this country is behind your back, and the CIA is not helping you. Really, it's hurting you, and it's an unfunded. It's funded, like $50 billion a year, but Moynihan was going to was talking about dismantling it, and John Kennedy was absolutely ordering its dismantlement. So think about it. Should have been dismantled in '63. We have the DIA and all these other intelligence agencies Kennedy started. You have like 16 intelligence agencies and 280-some thousand people with national security. You've got a country where there are no secrets, and the Israelis, Obama claims he's working with the Israelis to do everything they want. That's ridiculous. It's pretty much they want an empire. Someone wants to control the entire Mediterranean. That's Libya and Syria. And Syria is Russia's only port to the Mediterranean, so they don't want to lose it. They've been allied with them for thousands of years. So you're going over there to get involved in that entanglement. McCain wants to send, and I think we are sending weapons to the rebels over there. When Trump was saying on Libya that you don't know who these rebels are, and Gaddafi was saying they were Al-Qaeda. So you want to support Al-Qaeda, then you should go over there and sign up. But believe me, I don't believe it's American activity. I believe it's un-American. Anything against the Constitution. If you want to change it, you got to change the Constitution. You got to amend the Constitution. So you need to get involved in politics, not war. And war is a breakdown of national policy and dirty little wars. And fighting Israel's wars they've broken. We spent $3 trillion in Iraq for nothing, and how all these died for nothing. So if you want to die for nothing, you want to keep keep on doing this, then, you know, the devil, I'm sure, loves what you're doing, but I don't. Believe me, I'm not the devil. Okay. By the way, if you know, as Nietzsche says, Superman would be Caesar with the soul of Christ. Okay. And this is the real overman. You have to undergo reflective study of the past, to overcome the past, to free yourself from it, to gain control of your own destiny. Okay. Otherwise, you're just going in circles. And believe me, the right wing is not your friend. And the Republican Party is really anti-American right now. It's not the friend of America. It's really, when Trump's talking about running for president, as I said before, he'd be a good president of Israel. And he actually talks about China so much, he sounds like a China supporter. But, you know, I think Trump might be a good Secretary of Commerce, and he's talking about making deals. Okay, let him get on the cabinet and be a Commerce Secretary. But he's never run for dog catcher in New York, and he doesn't want to run for mayor. He's talking about Weiner being a pervert. That's true, but he's running for mayor. Trump is doing nothing but having his TV show, giving away $25,000 a month in charity or whatever. You know, building golf courses, etc. He's still looking at the ladies. Okay, Melanie, I'm sorry. He does still look at other women, you know. And if it weren't for him being so busy with the, you know, it's like too much of this world. It's like the saying, it's harder for a rich man to get through the, you know, to get into heaven than it is for a man to go through the eye of the needle, a camel to go through the eye of the needle. It'll be harder for Donald Trump to become president of the United States than it would be for me to go through the eye of the needle on a camel. Believe me, it would be impossible. Okay, that's enough. That's 1 hour.